Chapter 7 of our study of introductory economics, we look at a very important component of our economic engine and system, that being the pricing system. Here is an overview of what we will be covering in this chapter. The first thing we need to do is to give you a functional definition of price itself. Then we'll move on to taking a look at the effect that price has on supply and demand, and also consider the concept of disequilibrium. Moving on from there, we'll look at the governmental roles in controlling prices and the rationing of goods and services. Usually, with the exception of some unique situations, this winds up being a bad idea. And lastly, we'll take a look at the role of prices in a free market. We'll look at the advantages and benefits of a price-based system to an economy. Okay, let's get started, and as I mentioned a moment ago, give you a functional definition of the word price. Price is a tool for distributing and rationing goods and resources throughout an economy. Prices are signals to both producers and consumers. And that probably makes a lot of sense to you based upon the concepts that we covered in the most recent chapters, 5 and 6, the chapters on demand and supply. Now you'll also notice that I use the word rationing here in this definition. And you may be asking why. And the reason for that is it brings us back to a concept that we come to understand in chapters 1 and 2, a very fundamental concept in economics, the concept of scarcity. All goods and resources are scarce, and they have to be allocated by some method. And I think you'll find, based upon what we're going to cover in this chapter, is that the method of using prices is the best way to distribute and ration and allocate goods and services within an economy. Now I'm going to come back to the concept of rationing and take a little bit different take on it here in a couple of minutes. But before I do, I want to cover the term disequilibrium with you for some further background. Disequilibrium sounds awfully close to the concept of equilibrium that we looked at in chapters 5 and 6 as it related to supply and demand. And yes, disequilibrium is very close because it's actually the other side of a equilibrium price in a market. Disequilibrium within a market occurs when the quantity supplied is not equal to the quantity demanded. And that may occur when you have either excess demand or supply in a market. And how can that happen, you may be asking, because we're always trying to drive to an equilibrium point. It does, and it's usually temporary. So that leads us to a fundamental question. How does a market go about fixing a disequilibrium problem? Well, quite simply, as long as prices within the price system are flexible, meaning that they can change and respond to market forces, the market forces will naturally push the market towards an equilibrium point. And here's a great concept to think about in terms of the importance of prices, particularly to our economic system, the free market system. Prices are a key tool of Adam Smith's concept of the invisible hand. Now I want to come back to the term rationing and talk about it from the perspective that most people understand it and think about it, but also relate it to the concept of market equilibrium and disequilibrium. Sometimes the government officials think that to solve a disequilibrium problem or to force equilibrium in a market, that price management help or some other form of rationing is needed. And here's how most people think of it. Rationing being dividing up goods and services using some criteria other than pure price. So that leads us to the question is, why would the government officials believe that they need to do this? Here are the two most overwhelmingly common reasons given by government officials for intervention into the price system by the government. The first is that the officials believe that citizens or businesses are being either taken advantage of or abused. The second is that citizens or businesses cannot survive without the government intervention to the price system. If you dig a little bit deeper with these situations, you'll find that the government is really trying to protect some special interest for a political reason. With the exception of a very few unique situations, which I'll talk about in a moment, price controls or rationing wind up not working because they fail the tests that we've learned about in earlier chapters, the tests of equity and efficiency. As I mentioned a moment ago, there are some unique situations, in fact there are two, where implementation of price controls by the government might work. But a word of caution here. Whatever controls that are put in place must be tightly managed and monitored, because price controls can inflict tremendous damage on an economy, consumers, businesses, if they're not supervised and managed correctly. So here are the two unique situations. The first is during wars, when critical resources must be used and distributed in very specific ways. The second has been when new technology makes new industries potentially possible, and those would be industries or businesses that would provide great long-term benefits to a society. By putting price controls in place, you can encourage the development of these infant industries. And some examples of where this has been used in the past, it was when the airline industry was created, the electric distribution industry was created, as well as telecommunications. Let's now take a look at the types of government intervention to control prices. And there are two categories of this intervention. The first is a price ceiling. And what a price ceiling is a maximum that can be charged for a good. And it's usually applied to what we consider an essential good. If you're not familiar with essential being used in this context, essential means indispensable or fundamental, necessary, or critical. Here it's used in a sentence in another way. Her participation was essential or critical to the success of the team. I'm going to provide you with three examples of price ceilings that have been used in the past, and a point about this is that these are asked for by consumers, and they go to government officials at times where price for an essential good increases to a level where they feel one of two things: either that they can't survive in paying the price for this essential good, or they're being taken advantage of and abused by either an industry or a set of businesses for this essential good. The first price ceiling on a good that I'd like to talk about is a price ceiling on gasoline. And I bet that sounds great to you. What we're talking about here would be a limit on the price for a gallon of gas. Now, this has been tried 2 times by the government in the past, both times with absolutely disastrous results in the marketplace. And before I tell you what's happened, let me go back to chapter 5 and 6, and particularly chapter 6, where we're talking about supply. You have seen what happens when price in a market is either held down or pushed down so low that the suppliers to a market lose interest in supplying product or a good because they can't make any money. And what they do is either take their investment dollars or actually take the good that they're producing and go find some other market or place that they can make money with it. And 2 times during the late 1900s, the 1970s period to be exact, as a result of supply shocks having an impact on inflation. Many consumers felt that the price that the oil companies were charging for a gallon of gas was unreasonable. The government placed a price ceiling on a gallon of gas, and what the oil companies did is they simply took their oil and gasoline elsewhere, and we wound up having a shortage of gasoline. So that didn't turn out too well for the consumers in asking for the price ceiling. Here's a second example that's similar to the gasoline example. In times where rents for apartments have increased, consumers have gone to government officials and asked for price ceilings to be put on rents for apartments, one-bedroom studio apartments and the like. And the government officials have seen fit to do this in responding to their constituency. The reason the prices were what they were was because that's the price the landlord had to charge to maintain the building, heating, electric, and even maintenance of the building. But with the public feeling that that was too expensive and the government officials siding with them, they put a lower price in place. And what landlords wound up doing, because they had unprofitable pieces of real estate as part of their portfolio, they either took their investment money elsewhere and actually wound up abandoning buildings. And this has happened in numerous major cities across the United States, to where they actually walk away from the buildings that they owned and leave them completely unattended. The results have been what you see here in this picture in many cases, where the buildings become uninhabitable and again not working to the benefit of the consumer, who was feeling as though they were being exploited. A third example of a price ceiling that has been put in place, some of you may be aware of this, others not, is that there is a limit in the amount that a bank can charge you in terms of credit card interest. And this was put in place to make sure that the financial institutions, banks in particular, because they're the ones that issue credit cards, don't take advantage of people that can't control their spending habits, and that there's a limit in the amount that you could wind up paying for the money that you effectively borrow by using a credit card. We can use one of the most familiar and valued tools in the study of economics to illustrate the effects of price controls on markets. And that tool is the simple supply and demand graph that we've become familiar with in chapters 5 and 6. Now, in this case, we'll illustrate the effect of the price control, in this case being the price ceiling, using the market for rental housing, which I just spoke about a couple of moments ago. And before we start, let's set the stage here by taking a look at both the supply and demand component of this illustration. Demand is represented by the renters that are seeking rental apartments, and the supply is the apartments that are supplied by the landlords. And this market, no different than any other market, every market has an equilibrium price for it, which is illustrated here where the supply and demand curves intersect. Now, when a price ceiling is put in place, it is put in place below the market equilibrium price, because the concept of the price ceiling is that the market equilibrium price is unreasonable, it's too high. So it's set lower than the market equilibrium price. And here we have one illustrated. Now, a couple of things become very apparent in our understanding of how to read a supply and demand graph. We now see that the quantity demanded for apartments at this lower price certainly exceeds the willingness to supply. And we know from our past experience what happens to a market, and particularly suppliers in the market, in this case the landlords of the apartment buildings. When price gets depressed for whatever reason, they lose interest in the market because they cannot make as much money if they can't drive down costs, and some suppliers wind up leaving the market. Now, in this case with the rental apartments, you saw the picture of the abandoned buildings. The buildings in cases across the United States and cities became unprofitable for landlords to maintain and continue to manage, so they actually wind up abandoning them. And what that causes is the apartment buildings to become uninhabitable, which effectively creates a shortage. And a price ceiling will always do this with regard to a good. Once the price ceiling is put in place, you will see shortages occur, as happens with the rental housing in this case. And that works to the contrary, if you will, of what the intention was of putting the price ceiling in place to begin with. The people wanted a reasonable, in their mind, what they thought was affordable housing, and here you're actually limiting the amount of housing that winds up being available. So the question becomes, why do politicians or government officials do this and entertain putting into place price ceilings? Well, first, they're in the business of giving their constituents what they want and what they ask for in return for votes. There's not a lot of deep thinking that goes into this, and most politicians truly believe that the public is not fully invested in completely understanding the deeper and long-term ramifications of actions such as these. So let's summarize here what kind of damage is done by price ceilings, and we'll use our rent control example to illustrate the point. There are 4 considerations with regard to damages by price ceilings. The first is that it stifles business investment and economic growth by driving producers away from a market. It's all about opportunity costs. If the landlord, in this case, can't run a productive business, they're going to take their money and their assets somewhere else to make a reasonable living. If you're not familiar with the word stifles, as it's used here, stifle means to hold or kill off by preventing respiration, actually. Suffocate, smother, thwart. Without oxygen, the flame was stifled. So we drive away business investment. The second damage that's done is that it eliminates choice through reduced market supply. As we've seen, the actual amount of housing winds up, in this case, getting reduced because the buildings become uninhabitable, and that reduces the number of available units and the choice for consumers. A third damage using this example is that it actually promotes discrimination. It works against what the initial intent of the price ceiling is. The price ceiling was put in place really primarily to help lower income or lower wage earners be able to find affordable housing. When put in place, and it drives away the landlords and reduces the amount of legitimate housing, it actually works against the people that the price ceiling was supposed to help, the lower income wage earner who's looking for housing. And the fourth consideration from a damage standpoint is that a price ceiling will always promote or create a black market. Now we're going to actually illustrate what this looks like further for you in a little bit more depth. But first, let me give you the definition for a black market, functioning definition for a black market. It's when business is conducted without regard for government controls on either price, quantity, or the quality of the good or service. And black markets are very damaging to not only the market in particular, but society in general. Now, how does it play in this rent control example? Well, those landlords that are able to stay in the market and can continue providing housing that maybe have gotten their costs down to such a low level that they can survive and get some kind of return even with the price ceiling in place. The people who are renting apartments from those landlords actually wind up getting into the landlord business themselves, because what they turn around and do, because there's a market available, what they turn around and do is actually sublet their apartments to people who are desperately needing an apartment, and they charge a premium for that subletting. As a matter of fact, in many cases, the prices that they charge for subletting an apartment actually wind up exceeding the original market equilibrium price. We can also illustrate this using our supply and demand graph and actually show the social costs that are associated with this black market and show that it's damaging to a society. Here we have our supply and demand graph with our price ceiling illustrated. The people that are subletting apartments to people, and there's great demand for them, set a price far above the price ceiling situation, and in many cases, as I mentioned, above the market equilibrium price. And what this shaded area in our supply and demand graph represents is actually the social cost of the black market. So, in summary, I have a question for you. Given these four considerations, we have to ask ourselves, is the price ceiling for rent control and a rent control program an equitable and efficient program? And I think you know the answer to this. Obviously, it's not. Let's now move on to our second category of price control. The second category is what we call a price floor, the opposite of a price ceiling. The price floor is a minimum price for a good or service. And I'm going to talk about two examples. Here's the first one, the minimum wage. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the minimum wage, but let me give you the working definition for that. It's the minimum price that an employer can pay a worker for an hour of labor. And what's the purpose of a minimum wage? It specifically is to support low-skilled and inexperienced workers. But the question is, does it achieve this objective? Once again, we can use our supply and demand graph to illustrate the effects of price controls, in this case, a price floor on a market. Our market in this case is low-skilled labor. The demand curve on our graph represents the demand of employers who are looking to hire low-skilled labor. The supply curve is representing the labor force itself, the total number of low-skilled laborers in the market. And just like any other market, there is a market equilibrium price for low-skilled labor. Now, with a price floor in this example, it's assumed that the market equilibrium price is not adequate for the workers. So a price floor is put in place, a minimum wage, that raises the price level for the market. And if we look at what this does to our market conditions, and we know how to read our supply and demand graph, we see that with the price floor, the quantity supplied of laborers at the higher wage rate exceeds the demand from the employers. Now, what this causes is far more workers making themselves available at this price level, but far fewer employers interested in hiring. And that winds up creating a situation where you have more workers than there is employers looking to hire. And we have a surplus situation. So the question here, too, just like with our price ceiling, is why do politicians do this? It's very easy for them to say to low-skilled workers, gee, you asked for a higher wage rate. We gave that to you with the minimum wage, and hopefully in return for votes, they gave them what they were looking for. And the politicians truly believe that the public's not, again, completely deeply invested in understanding what the potential ramifications for this can be. In fact, when the minimum wage is changed and usually ratcheted upward, it increased costs for businesses, and businesses will actually trim their labor resources back further, and that contributes to the surplus situation, which, in another way of describing it, raises the level of unemployment. As we did with price ceilings, let's summarize by looking at the damage done by price floors. And we'll use the minimum wage example to illustrate our point. There are 4 damage considerations. Ever since the minimum wage was put in place, the wage rate has never been reduced. It has continually been increased over time. And when wage rates go up for businesses, that adds additional costs to running a business. And when costs are added to running a business, it winds up over the long term discouraging business investment. And when business investment is discouraged, economic growth is discouraged. So burdensome has been the labor cost increase for some businesses that it has actually driven them or encouraged them to look for other solutions to the cost problem. And this has wound up creating illegal worker problems in a number of areas. Some businesses, in dealing with the costs, look for substitutions for labor, say in technology, where they can take a position that requires a less skilled worker or a less experienced worker and automate it. Businesses are driven by the minimum wage to do that because over the long term, a piece of technology or machinery winds up being less costly for the business than an actual employee. And what that has led to is higher levels of unemployment for young adults and low-skilled workers. And related to that is the minimum wage was designed to help young adults or less experienced workers and low-skilled workers by supporting them. With the higher levels of unemployment and the reduced hiring, this actually very similar to what we saw in the price ceiling situation works towards promoting discrimination against these groups. Here's a second example of a price floor. Agriculture price supports, also known as subsidies. They're paid to farmers. And what the payment is the difference between the market equilibrium price, which is the world market price for a good, and the price that they need to make a specific profit. The first question that comes up about these is why. Farmers on average make 30% more income than the average American. Why might they need price supports? Here's a simple list of subsidies that are paid to farmers. This list certainly does not include all the subsidies that are paid, but it'll give you a pretty good idea as to what types of things subsidies are paid on. Now, there are 2 general reasons why subsidies are paid, or the rationale behind them, if you will. The first is the government likes to pay subsidies to make sure that farmers stay very interested in making sure that we have a stable food supply through good times and bad. And the second reason is that the government wants to make sure that farmers invest and stay very interested in providing us with the highest quality food supply that we can possibly have. Now, some cynics will tell you there's another side to this, that some of this money, which is tax dollars that are paid to, as the subsidies, wind up getting funneled back in to support political campaigns. But that's a subject for another discussion at another time. We can also once again use our supply and demand graph to illustrate some really interesting things with regard to subsidies and agricultural price supports as price floors. Here we have our market and our graph for the market of cotton, let's say. It could be any agricultural product that there's a subsidy paid on. Cotton is certainly one of them. A couple of things to point out here. Demand is pretty straightforward. The demand curve representing the demand from the public around the world, if you will, or even in this country. The market equilibrium price is considered the world price in this illustration, and the supply is obviously provided by the farmers. One other thing I'd like to point out here about this chart, you notice how the supply curve is pushed pretty far over to the right. And the reason for that is that over the past 100 years, the technology advancements in farming has been astronomical, and we produce more today than we ever have around the world in terms of food products and other agricultural products. So much so that probably to really almost correctly illustrate this, we could move the supply curve almost off the chart to the right. But where it's at here for our purposes will be sufficient to illustrate the point. So let's go illustrate how the price floor of a subsidy is reflected in this chart. Here we have our price floor set in above the market equilibrium price, and that dollar difference between the market equilibrium price and the price floor that's set is what's paid to farmers from your taxes. Now notice something else about when we put the price floor in as to where it winds up crossing the supply curve. What happens with this price floor so that the farmers can wind up getting paid as much as they possibly can, it encourages them to overproduce and produce at a supply level that would exceed demand at the price level. And this winds up leaving us with a surplus. And let me give you an example. The United States sends millions of tons of agricultural products overseas in terms of foreign aid to other countries for free. If I recall the statistic correctly from a few years ago, is that the United States, as an example, produces enough flour, I guess, from wheat that could provide everybody in the world with at least 7 loaves of bread. The volume is enormous, and that has some ramifications in other countries, which I'll talk about in a couple of moments. Once again, let's summarize, as we did with price ceilings and our first price floor example, the minimum wage, by looking at the damage done in this case by agriculture subsidies. And there are 3 damage considerations here. Subsidies clearly artificially inflate the prices for goods. And whenever prices go up, especially a fair amount, it lowers your standard of living. Secondly, the agricultural subsidies certainly encourage overproduction. And overproduction wastes critical resources. Thirdly, as a result of foreign aid, which is given away for free, the agricultural products that I mentioned a moment ago, they contribute to world poverty in other countries by discouraging development of agricultural businesses in those third world countries. And that is rather ironic. If you're not familiar with the term ironic, it means the use of words to convey the opposite of their literal meaning, cynical, biting. It's ironic that the minimum wage hurts the people it's supposed to help the most. So these 3 damages are considerable and really need to be taken into account. So as we had with price ceilings, I have a concluding price floor summary question for you to think about. Are price floors equitable and efficient? We've now taken a look at both price ceilings and price floors. So let's summarize and look at the 3 reasons why government price controls in general and rationing, with the rare exception of a few unique circumstances, never works. The first reason is that price controls lead to market inefficiency and unproductive resources by 2 things. First, it limits choices for the people that the price controls, or the groups that the price controls are actually designed to help. The second is by eliminating incentives for businesses to invest in their business and industry and help grow the economy. Secondly, price controls lead to inequity by promoting discrimination among the groups that the price controls are actually intended to help. And third, price controls stifle growth, economic growth that is, and reduces the standard of living for our society. Fundamentally, we do have an unregulated price-based system in our economy, and that provides us with 6 advantages. The first is that prices provide a very easy to understand common language for both buyers and sellers to communicate with each other. Secondly, prices provide real-time information, especially in this age of advanced information technology, regarding supply and demand for a good or service. Third, a flexible price system provides a very convenient tool for solving problems of excess supply and demand that are run into. If you have an excess of either, simply change a price, and it's usually easily solved. And fourth, unlike with a price-controlled system where a government would have to invest in regulating and supervising the price controls, and that gets costly for a governmental institution to do, an unregulated price-based system does not cost anything to administer. And that's particularly true in today's high-tech world, where price changes can be made in literally matters of seconds for products to adjust for supply and demand. Fifth, an unregulated price-based system promotes a very diverse number of goods and services because prices encourage choice and competition among competitors. And sixth, theoretically, an unregulated price-based system will promote better products, as producers can target the specific audience they want. And what we're getting at here is that manufacturers, let's say, can invest resources in producing a wide variety of products. They can produce high-performing products for the public that needs a specific type of high-performing product, and they can produce lower-performing products and be able to, with an unregulated price system, recover the cost of the resources put into the development and the marketing of the product. As we bring our chapter on prices to a close, we want to take a moment to look at 3 occasional free market problems that arise with an unregulated price-based system. As you know, there is no perfect system, and the critics of free markets and unregulated price-based systems call these occasional problems that arise market failures. But I think as what you'll see is that they are relatively minor in the scheme of things and usually get resolved through natural market forces. Here's the first one. It's called imperfect competitions. It's when sometimes there's not enough competition among sellers in a market to lower a market price. This is usually when somebody corners a market and establishes a monopoly in a market. And I'll talk more about monopolies in next chapter, Chapter 8, Market Structures. And unknown to most people is that monopolies are perfectly legal. And as long as the business that has a monopoly in a market doesn't misbehave in terms of engaging in anti-competitive business practices, they're free to operate and to sell their goods and services. And what happens over the long run, and this refers back to my point about through natural market forces, some of these market failures or problems being resolved, is that competition usually finds its way into a market and reduces the monopoly power of the organization supplying the good or service, and things get resolved over the long run anyway. The second problem that occurs, or market failure if you will, is the situation that we call imperfect information. This is when buyers do not have enough information to make an informed decision. And it happens rarely and usually in specific types of markets. And it usually happens in markets where technology is heavily dependent upon to conduct business. And technology has become a two-edged sword in these businesses. The best example I could give is in the trading of currencies and financial products. The transactions that take place in the banking and the finance industry move at lightning speed these days because most of it is done on a technology base. And a lot of times as the markets move and information becomes available, investors have a difficult time keeping up with changes and wind up with limited or dated information or not enough information to make informed decisions about their investment products. The third type of problem is called spillover costs, and this concept is debated as to whether it is really a problem or not, or whether it's just part of doing business based also upon choices or regulations that are forced on businesses. It's called spillover costs. It's the cost passed on to the consumer in the form of higher prices as a result of government regulations. The reason we debate as to whether this is really a problem or not is some people say if the government is regulating a business, the government's acting on behalf of people who want the business regulated. Environmental regulations as an example. So if the people speaking through the government want a business regulated and restrictions put on a business which are going to increase its costs, the business then raises its prices to maintain its viability and survival. So whether this is a real problem or not, spillover costs that is, it's really in the eye of the beholder. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 7, our prices chapter. We'll look forward to seeing you in Chapter 8, which is called Market Structures, where we go back and take a look at markets in ways of classifying them based upon their characteristics. We'll see you then.